In the grand halls of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal protocol have shaped the very air that aristocrats breathe, a young princess was about to shatter tradition with nothing more than her unwavering voice and fierce determination. Princess Charlotte, barely 10 years old, stood face to face with some of the most powerful officials in the British monarchy, her small frame trembling not with fear, but with righteous anger. The ornate grandfather clock in the corner ticked ominously as seasoned palace aides, men who had served 3 generations of royals, found themselves speechless before a child who refused to bow to their demands. What happened next would not only change the course of Charlotte's young life, but would send shockwaves through the very foundations of the royal establishment, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with the smallest voices refusing to be silenced. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors where Princess Charlotte walked with determined steps. Her school shoes echoed softly in the corridor as she made her way toward the East Wing, where her private tutor waited for their daily history lesson. But today felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made the young princess pause mid-step and look around the familiar surroundings with fresh eyes. Charlotte had always been different from other royal children. While her brothers Prince George and Prince Louis seemed content to follow the carefully laid-out paths that palace protocol demanded, Charlotte questioned everything. She asked why girls couldn't inherit the throne first, why certain rooms were off-limits to children, and why the palace staff always spoke in hushed tones when discussing family matters. Her parents, Prince William and Catherine, had encouraged her curiosity to some extent, but they also knew that being royal came with certain unchangeable realities. The trouble began 3 weeks earlier when Charlotte befriended Marcus, a young security guard who had recently joined the palace protection team. Marcus was different from the other guards. He was only 22, fresh out of military training, and he treated Charlotte like a normal child rather than an untouchable royal figure. When she asked him questions about his job, he answered honestly. When she wanted to learn about the security protocols, he explained them in simple terms that she could understand. Most importantly, when she felt overwhelmed by the constant supervision and rigid schedules, Marcus listened without judgment. Their friendship developed naturally during Charlotte's daily walks through the palace gardens. While other guards maintained professional distance, Marcus would point out different birds in the trees, explain how the garden security system worked, or simply chat about normal things like favorite foods and movies. For Charlotte, these conversations were precious moments of normalcy in a life that felt increasingly controlled and artificial. The palace staff began to notice the unusual bond between the young princess and the guard. Margaret Thornfield, the head of royal protocol, observed their interactions with growing concern. She had served the royal family for over 30 years and understood that maintaining proper boundaries was essential for both security and tradition. In her experience, personal attachments between royals and staff members inevitably led to complications that could embarrass the monarchy or compromise safety procedures. Margaret scheduled a meeting with the senior palace administrators to discuss what she called the Charlotte situation. The group included Sir Richard Pembroke, the private secretary to Prince William, Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, Charlotte's head governess, and Colonel James Morrison, the chief of palace security. They gathered in the oak-paneled conference room that had witnessed countless discussions about royal family matters over the decades. The conversation started diplomatically, with Margaret expressing her observations about Charlotte's growing attachment to the young guard. She explained that while Marcus appeared to be a dedicated employee, the informal nature of his relationship with the princess violated established protocols. Sir Richard agreed, noting that allowing such relationships to continue could set dangerous precedents for future interactions between royal children and staff members. Mrs. Hastings shared her concerns about Charlotte's increasingly independent behavior. The princess had begun questioning her daily schedule, asking why she couldn't spend more time in certain areas of the palace, and showing resistance to some of the traditional etiquette lessons that were considered essential for her royal education. She worried that Marcus's influence was encouraging Charlotte to challenge authority in ways that could become problematic as she grew older. Colonel Morrison approached the issue from a security perspective. He explained that while Marcus was a capable guard with an excellent service record, personal relationships between protection officers and their charges created potential vulnerabilities. Professional distance wasn't just about tradition. It was about maintaining the objectivity necessary to make critical security decisions without emotional interference. As the discussion continued, the administrators reached a consensus that action needed to be taken. They decided that Marcus should be reassigned to a different position within the Royal Protection Unit, one that wouldn't involve direct contact with the royal children. The transfer would be presented as a promotion, recognizing his good work while removing him from the situation that concerned them. Margaret volunteered to speak with Charlotte about appropriate relationships with staff members. She believed that the young princess needed to understand the importance of maintaining proper boundaries, not just for protocol reasons, but for her own development as a future member of the royal family. The conversation would need to be handled delicately, acknowledging Charlotte's feelings while firmly establishing the expectations for her behavior. However, the administrators underestimated both Charlotte's intelligence and her determination. The princess had been aware of the increased scrutiny surrounding her friendship with Marcus for several days. She noticed the way other staff members looked at them during their conversations, the subtle changes in scheduling that seemed designed to limit their interactions, and the careful questions that Mrs. Hastings had begun asking about her daily activities. Charlotte's awareness of the situation intensified her feelings about the unfairness of royal life. She began to see her friendship with Marcus as a symbol of the normalcy that was constantly being denied to her. The thought of losing this connection filled her with a mixture of sadness and anger that she struggled to express in ways that the adults around her would take seriously. The young princess started paying closer attention to the dynamics of palace life, observing how decisions were made and who held real power in different situations. She noticed that her parents, despite their titles and public prominence, often seemed constrained by the expectations and advice of palace officials. She saw how protocol and tradition were used to justify decisions that prioritized institutional concerns over individual happiness or relationships. These observations fueled Charlotte's growing sense of injustice about her situation. She began to formulate a plan to protect her friendship with Marcus, though she wasn't yet sure what form that plan would take. What she did know was that she wasn't going to simply accept whatever decision the palace administrators made about her life without having her voice heard. The tension in the palace continued to build as both sides prepared for a confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. The administrators moved forward with their plans to transfer Marcus, confident that they were acting in everyone's best interests. Charlotte, meanwhile, gathered her courage for what she sensed would be the most important stand of her young life. The stage was being set for a battle of wills that would test the limits of royal protocol and challenge assumptions about power, authority, and the rights of even the youngest members of the monarchy. Neither side fully understood what the other was capable of, but both were about to find out in ways that would surprise everyone involved. As the week progressed, the subtle changes in palace routine became more noticeable. Marcus found himself assigned to different shifts and locations, making his usual conversations with Charlotte increasingly difficult to maintain. The princess noticed these changes immediately and began to realize that her worst fears about adult interference in her friendship were coming true. The final catalyst came on a Thursday afternoon when Charlotte overheard a conversation between Mrs. Hastings and Margaret Thornfield in the corridor outside her study room. They were discussing the timeline for Marcus's transfer and the script for their upcoming conversation with the princess about appropriate boundaries. The casual way they planned to reshape her life without consulting her feelings sparked something fierce and unstoppable in Charlotte's young heart. That evening, Charlotte made her decision. She would not allow the adults to simply rearrange her world according to their preferences. She would stand up for herself and for Marcus in a way that would force them to acknowledge her as more than just a child to be managed. The next morning would bring the confrontation that everyone had been unconsciously preparing for, though none of them anticipated the strength and determination that Charlotte was about to display. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that seemed to sharpen every detail of the palace into perfect focus. Charlotte woke before her usual time, her mind immediately alert and focused on the day ahead. She had spent the night refining her strategy, thinking through possible arguments and responses to the various excuses that the palace officials would likely present. Today would be the day she took control of her own story. Charlotte dressed carefully in her favorite blue dress, the one that her mother always said brought out her eyes and made her look particularly determined. She understood the psychology of appearance in royal circles better than most adults realized. If she was going to face down the palace establishment, she wanted to look every inch the princess while doing it. Her hair was brushed until it gleamed, and she selected the small sapphire earrings that had been a gift from her great-grandmother. Instead of waiting for Mrs. Hastings to collect her for breakfast, Charlotte made her way directly to the morning room, where she knew the senior staff would be conducting their daily briefing. She had observed this routine many times before, noting how the administrators gathered at 8:30 sharp to review the day's schedule and address any concerns that had arisen overnight. The morning briefing was a sacred ritual in palace operations, a time when the various departments coordinated their activities and ensured that everything would run smoothly according to royal protocol. Margaret Thornfield typically presided over these meetings, reviewing security reports, scheduling changes, and any special considerations for the day ahead. It was during these briefings that decisions affecting the royal family were often finalized and implemented. Charlotte positioned herself outside the morning room door, listening to the familiar voices discussing various administrative matters. She waited until she heard Margaret mention Marcus's name, confirming that today was indeed when they planned to execute their transfer decision. Taking a deep breath, Charlotte pushed open the heavy wooden door and walked into the room with the kind of confidence that caught everyone completely off guard. The conversation stopped immediately as 6 pairs of adult eyes turned to focus on the young princess standing in the doorway. Margaret Thornfield was the first to recover from the surprise, quickly adopting her professional smile and preparing to escort Charlotte back to her proper morning routine. However, something in the princess's posture and expression made her pause before speaking. Charlotte looked around the room, making eye contact with each person present. She recognized Margaret Thornfield, Sir Richard Pembroke, Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, Colonel Morrison, and 2 other administrative staff members whose names she had learned through careful observation. These were the people who made decisions about her life, often without her knowledge and certainly without her input. The young princess spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried none of the uncertainty that the adults had expected. She announced that she was there to discuss Marcus and the plan she knew they had made regarding his future position. Her directness and obvious preparation shocked the administrators, who had assumed that their activities were happening beyond Charlotte's awareness or understanding. Margaret attempted to redirect the conversation, suggesting that Charlotte shouldn't be concerned with staff assignments and that such matters were best left to adults who understood the complexities involved. She used the gentle but firm tone that had worked effectively with royal children for decades, expecting Charlotte to accept the authority implicit in her words and demeanor. Charlotte's response surprised everyone in the room. Instead of backing down or accepting the dismissal, she calmly explained that she was very much concerned with decisions that affected people who mattered to her. She stated clearly that Marcus had become important to her not because she failed to understand boundaries, but because he treated her with genuine respect and kindness in ways that made her feel like a real person rather than just a royal obligation. The princess went on to describe her observations about palace life, demonstrating an understanding of power dynamics and institutional priorities that none of the adults had realized she possessed. She talked about how decisions were made in the name of protecting the royal family, but often seemed more focused on protecting the comfort and convenience of the adults who managed royal affairs. Sir Richard attempted to explain the importance of protocol and tradition in maintaining the dignity and security of a monarchy. He spoke about how personal relationships between royals and staff members had historically led to complications that could embarrass the family or compromise their public image. His tone was patient and educational, as if he were explaining complex concepts to a child who couldn't possibly grasp their significance. Charlotte listened to his explanation respectfully, then proceeded to dismantle his arguments with logic that left him speechless. She pointed out that many of the most beloved members of the royal family had been those who connected authentically with people from all backgrounds. She mentioned how her great-grandmother had been admired precisely because she treated everyone with genuine warmth and interest, regardless of their position in the palace hierarchy. Mrs. Hastings tried a different approach, focusing on Charlotte's age and the need for her to focus on her education and development rather than worrying about adult concerns. She emphasized that the decision about Marcus was being made with everyone's best interests in mind, including Charlotte's, and that the princess would understand the wisdom of it when she was older. The young princess's response to this patronizing approach revealed the depth of her frustration with being dismissed because of her age. She explained that being young didn't mean being stupid or insensitive, and that her feelings and relationships mattered just as much as those of adults. She argued that learning to value and maintain meaningful relationships was actually an important part of her education, one that was being undermined by the artificial barriers that palace protocol insisted upon. Colonel Morrison, speaking from his security perspective, explained that emotional attachments could compromise the objective judgment that protection officers needed to maintain in dangerous situations. He used examples from security training to illustrate how personal feelings could interfere with professional responsibilities, potentially putting everyone at greater risk. Charlotte surprised him by asking detailed questions about specific security scenarios, demonstrating that her conversations with Marcus had given her a more sophisticated understanding of protection protocols than anyone had realized. She challenged the assumption that friendship necessarily compromised professionalism, pointing out that trust and mutual respect might actually enhance security effectiveness rather than undermining it. As the discussion continued, the adults in the room began to realize that they were not dealing with a typical child's tantrum or temporary attachment. Charlotte had clearly thought deeply about the issues involved and had developed coherent arguments that addressed their concerns while defending her position. Her intelligence and determination were forcing them to engage with her as a serious participant in the conversation rather than simply managing her emotions. The atmosphere in the room shifted as the administrators recognized that their usual methods of handling royal children were not going to work in this situation. Charlotte's combination of logical argument, emotional articulation, and firm resolve created a dynamic that none of them had encountered before. They found themselves actually debating policy with a 10-year-old princess who was holding her own in ways that challenged their assumptions about authority and decision-making. Margaret Thornfield attempted to regain control of the situation by emphasizing the final nature of the decision that had already been made. She explained that Marcus's transfer had been approved at the highest levels and that reversing it would require explanations and justifications that could draw unwanted attention to the entire situation. Her tone suggested that the conversation had gone far enough and that it was time for Charlotte to accept reality. Charlotte's response to this attempt at closure would prove to be the turning point of the entire confrontation. Instead of accepting defeat or becoming emotional, the young princess straightened her shoulders and delivered the statement that would echo through palace corridors for years to come. She declared that she had no intention of accepting a decision that had been made without considering her feelings or input, and that she was prepared to take whatever actions are necessary to ensure that her voice was heard and respected. The silence that followed Charlotte's declaration was filled with a tension that none of the adults had anticipated when they had planned their routine staff transfer. They suddenly realized that they were facing a royal child who was willing to challenge the entire system of authority that governed palace life, and they weren't sure how to respond to such unprecedented determination. The young princess used the silence to reinforce her position, explaining that she understood the power that her title and position gave her, and that she was prepared to use that power to protect the relationships and values that mattered to her. Her words carried an implicit threat that sent a chill through the room, as the administrators realized that Charlotte was not bluffing about her willingness to escalate the situation. The morning briefing had transformed into something entirely unexpected, a genuine confrontation between established authority and emerging independence that would require resolution on terms that none of the participants had originally anticipated. The battle lines were now clearly drawn, and both sides understood that the outcome would set important precedents for Charlotte's future role in palace life and the monarchy itself. The tension in the morning room had reached a critical point, where every word carried the weight of potential consequences that none of the participants had fully anticipated. Charlotte stood at the center of the confrontation, her small frame somehow commanding the attention and respect of seasoned palace administrators who had spent decades managing royal affairs. The young princess had transformed a routine staff meeting into a defining moment that would reshape relationships and power dynamics within the palace walls. Margaret Thornfield found herself in an impossible position. Her 30 years of experience had prepared her for many challenging situations, but never for a direct challenge to palace authority from a royal child who possessed both the intelligence to articulate her position and the determination to follow through on her threats. The traditional methods of managing such situations simply didn't apply when the person creating the problem held a position that was, technically speaking, higher than her own in the palace hierarchy. Sir Richard Pembroke attempted to find a middle ground that might satisfy Charlotte while maintaining the essence of their original decision. He suggested that perhaps Marcus could remain in his current position for a transitional period, allowing Charlotte time to adjust to the change while ensuring that proper boundaries were gradually established. His proposal was carefully worded to sound like a compromise, while actually changing very little about the final outcome they had planned. Charlotte saw through this diplomatic maneuvering immediately. Her response demonstrated not only her intelligence, but also her growing sophistication in dealing with adult attempts to manipulate situations. She pointed out that a delayed transfer was still a transfer, and that creating artificial timelines for ending her friendship with Marcus was just another way of dismissing her feelings and preferences. Her rejection of the compromise was delivered with the kind of clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. The young princess then took the conversation in a direction that caught everyone off guard. Instead of continuing to argue defensively about her relationship with Marcus, she began to challenge the fundamental assumptions that guided palace operations. She questioned why staff members were expected to maintain emotional distance from the royal family when genuine care and concern might actually make them more effective in their roles. Charlotte's arguments drew on examples from her own observations of palace life. She mentioned how the most beloved and effective staff members throughout royal history had been those who combined professional competence with personal devotion to the families they served. She pointed out that the current emphasis on emotional distance often created an atmosphere of artificial formality that made genuine communication and trust more difficult to achieve. Mrs. Hastings tried to redirect the discussion back to more immediate concerns, emphasizing that Charlotte's education and development required structure and appropriate role models. She argued that allowing the princess to form close friendships with staff members could interfere with her ability to learn the social skills and understanding of hierarchy that would be essential for her future role as a senior royal. The princess's response to this argument revealed the depth of her frustration with the artificial constraints of royal life. She explained that her interactions with Marcus had actually taught her more about leadership, respect, and genuine human connection than many of her formal lessons. She argued that learning to relate authentically to people from different backgrounds and positions was exactly the kind of education that would make her a better royal, not a worse one. Colonel Morrison, recognizing that the security arguments had not been effective, tried a different approach based on practical considerations. He explained that the media attention and public scrutiny that surrounded the royal family meant that any unusual relationships or departures from established protocol could become sources of unwanted publicity and speculation. He suggested that protecting Charlotte from such attention was an important part of his professional responsibility. Charlotte's response to this concern demonstrated her growing awareness of how public perception and media management influenced royal decisions. She acknowledged the reality of media scrutiny, but challenged the assumption that avoiding all risks was the best strategy for managing public relations. She suggested that authenticity and genuine human connection might actually generate more positive public responses than rigid adherence to formal protocol. The discussion had evolved into something far more significant than a disagreement about one staff member's assignment. Charlotte had effectively put the entire philosophy of palace operations on trial, forcing the administrators to defend not just their specific decision, but their entire approach to managing royal life. Her arguments were coherent, well-reasoned, and grounded in observations that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the issues involved. As the conversation continued, the adults in the room began to realize that they were dealing with a young person who possessed both the intellectual capacity and the moral conviction to challenge established systems in ways that could not be easily dismissed or managed. Charlotte's combination of royal status, sharp intelligence, and unwavering determination created a dynamic that none of their traditional strategies could effectively address. The turning point came when Charlotte shifted from defensive arguments to proactive proposals. Instead of simply opposing the transfer of Marcus, she began to outline alternative approaches that might address the administrator's concerns while respecting her relationship with the guard. Her suggestions demonstrated creative problem-solving skills that impressed even the adults who disagreed with her position. Charlotte proposed that clear guidelines could be established for staff interactions with royal children that would maintain professional standards while allowing for authentic human connection. She suggested that such guidelines might actually be more effective than blanket prohibitions because they would provide specific standards that everyone could understand and follow. Her proposal showed that she was capable of thinking systematically about complex organizational issues. The young princess also addressed the security concerns directly, suggesting that trusted relationships between protection officers and their charges might actually enhance security effectiveness. She argued that guards who genuinely cared about the people they were protecting might be more alert to potential threats and more motivated to maintain the highest professional standards. Margaret Thornfield found herself in the unprecedented position of seriously considering policy proposal from 10-year-old, even as she struggled with the implications of allowing a royal child to influence administrative decisions in such a direct way. The traditional power structures of palace life had been turned upside down, and she wasn't sure how to restore the normal balance of authority. Sir Richard Pembroke attempted to regain control of the situation by emphasizing the need to consult with Prince William and Catherine before making any changes to established policies. He suggested that such significant decisions required parental input and approval, hoping to move the discussion away from Charlotte's direct influence and back to more traditional channels of authority. Charlotte's response to this procedural delay revealed another dimension of her strategic thinking. She calmly explained that she was fully prepared to discuss the situation with her parents, and that she was confident they would support her position once they understood the issues involved. Her willingness to escalate the matter to higher authorities demonstrated that she had considered all the potential consequences of her stand. The princess then made a statement that sent shock waves through the room. She announced that if the adults continued to dismiss her concerns and proceeded with Marcus's transfer without addressing her objections, she was prepared to make her opposition known in ways that would bring unwanted attention to the situation. Her threat was delivered with the kind of calm determination that made it clear she was not bluffing. The administrators suddenly realized that they were facing a potential public relations disaster. Charlotte's threat to make the situation public transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. They were no longer dealing with an internal management issue that could be handled through normal channels. They were facing the possibility that their personnel decisions could become subject to media scrutiny and public debate. Mrs. Hastings attempted to manage Charlotte's threat by emphasizing the importance of handling family matters privately. She appealed to the princess's sense of loyalty and discretion, suggesting that exposing internal palace disagreements would damage the royal family's reputation and undermine public confidence in the monarchy. Charlotte's response demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of how power worked in a modern world. She explained that she had no desire to damage her family's reputation, but that she also would not allow her own voice to be silenced in the name of protecting institutional interests. She made it clear that the choice between public controversy and internal compromise was entirely in the hands of the administrators. The young princess had effectively turned the tables on the adults who had expected to manage her through traditional authority structures. By demonstrating her willingness to escalate the situation beyond their control, she had created a dynamic where her concerns could no longer be dismissed or ignored. The morning briefing had become a negotiation between equals, with Charlotte holding cards that none of the administrators had anticipated she would be willing to play. The silence that followed Charlotte's final statement was filled with the recognition that the situation had reached a point where traditional solutions would no longer work. Both sides understood that the outcome of this confrontation would establish important precedents for how palace authority and royal independence would be balanced in the future. The young princess had successfully challenged the system, and now everyone involved would have to find new ways of working together that acknowledged her voice and respected her determination. The atmosphere in the morning room had become electric with possibility and tension as Charlotte's ultimatum hung in the air like a challenge that could reshape everything about how the palace operated. The young princess had successfully maneuvered the conversation to a point where the adults could no longer simply impose their will and expect compliance. For the first time in palace history, a royal child had forced senior administrators to negotiate rather than dictate, and everyone in the room understood the revolutionary nature of what was happening. Margaret Thornfield looked around at her colleagues, searching for guidance in a situation that fell completely outside her extensive experience. The traditional hierarchy that had governed palace operations for generations was being challenged by someone who technically outranked all of them, but who was supposed to be subject to their management and guidance. The contradiction created a power vacuum that none of them knew how to fill. Colonel Morrison was the first to break the silence, his military background providing him with a framework for dealing with unexpected tactical situations. He addressed Charlotte directly, acknowledging her intelligence and determination while explaining that security considerations required certain non-negotiable protocols. His tone was respectful but firm, treating her as a worthy opponent rather than a child to be managed. The colonel proposed a compromise that demonstrated his recognition of Charlotte's legitimate concerns while maintaining essential security requirements. He suggested that Marcus could remain in his current position under a modified set of guidelines that would formalize appropriate interaction protocols while allowing for the continuation of their friendship. The proposal represented a significant shift from the original plan to transfer Marcus entirely. Charlotte listened carefully to Colonel Morrison's suggestion, evaluating it with the same analytical approach she had applied throughout the confrontation. She asked specific questions about the proposed guidelines, seeking to understand exactly what limitations would be imposed and how they would affect her relationship with Marcus. Her questions revealed both her intelligence and her determination to ensure that any compromise would be meaningful rather than cosmetic. Sir Richard Pembroke found himself impressed despite his reservations about the precedent being set. Charlotte's ability to engage in serious policy discussions while maintaining focus on her core objectives demonstrated leadership qualities that he had not expected to see for several more years. He began to consider whether accommodating her concerns might actually serve the long-term interests of preparing her for future royal responsibilities. The senior administrator proposed expanding Colonel Morrison's suggestion to include a broader review of staff interaction policies with royal children. He suggested that Charlotte's insights might actually help them develop more effective approaches that balance security and protocol requirements with the human needs of the young royals. His proposal represented a dramatic shift from managing Charlotte to partnering with her in policy development. Mrs. Hastings struggled with the implications of treating a 10-year-old as a policy consultant, even one with Charlotte's obvious capabilities. Her training and experience emphasized the importance of maintaining adult authority and ensuring that royal children developed appropriate respect for established structures. The idea of allowing Charlotte to influence fundamental palace operations challenged everything she believed about proper child development. However, Mrs. Hastings also recognized that Charlotte had already demonstrated her ability to influence palace operations through direct confrontation. The choice was not between maintaining traditional authority structures and allowing Charlotte input. The choice was between finding constructive channels for her influence and dealing with the disruptive consequences of trying to suppress it entirely. Charlotte sensed the shift in the room's dynamics and pressed her advantage by outlining specific suggestions for the policy review that Sir Richard had proposed. She recommended that the new guidelines should focus on building trust and communication rather than simply imposing restrictions. Her suggestions demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of organizational psychology that surprised the adults who had been thinking of her as an exceptionally bright child rather than a serious strategic thinker. The princess proposed that staff members should be evaluated based on their ability to balance professional competence with appropriate personal engagement. She argued that guards and other staff who could connect authentically with the royal family while maintaining professional standards would be more effective than those who simply followed rules without understanding their purpose. Margaret Thornfield realized that the conversation had moved far beyond the original issue of Marcus's assignment. Charlotte had successfully transformed a personnel dispute into a fundamental review of palace operations, and she had done so in ways that made it difficult to reverse the process without appearing arbitrary and unreasonable. The young princess had outmaneuvered experienced administrators using nothing but logic, determination, and strategic thinking. The head of protocol found herself considering possibilities that would have seemed unthinkable when she had first entered the room. Charlotte's arguments had a coherence and practicality that made them difficult to dismiss, even when they challenged established traditions. Margaret began to wonder whether some of those traditions might need updating to reflect the realities of modern royal life and the capabilities of the current generation of royal children. As the discussion continued, Charlotte demonstrated another dimension of her strategic thinking by addressing the concerns about precedent that she knew were troubling the administrators. She explained that her goal was not to undermine palace authority in general, but to ensure that her voice was heard and respected in matters that directly affected her life and relationships. She offered to work within established structures as long as those structures provided meaningful opportunities for her input. The princess also addressed the concerns about media attention and public scrutiny that had been raised earlier. She proposed that demonstrating the royal family's commitment to treating staff members as valued individuals rather than interchangeable functionaries might actually generate positive publicity. Her suggestion showed that she understood the public relations implications of palace policies better than the adults had expected. Colonel Morrison found himself genuinely impressed by Charlotte's comprehensive approach to problem-solving. Her proposals addressed security concerns while offering creative alternatives that could actually enhance protection effectiveness. He began to see her not as an obstacle to overcome, but as a resource that could contribute valuable insights to security planning and implementation. The shift in the colonel's perspective represented a crucial turning point in the confrontation. Once one of the senior administrators began treating Charlotte as a legitimate partner in policy development, the others found it increasingly difficult to maintain their positions of simple authority. The young princess had successfully changed the fundamental nature of the conversation. Sir Richard Pembroke proposed establishing a formal mechanism for Charlotte to provide input on policies that affected her directly. He suggested that creating official channels for her involvement might actually strengthen palace operations by ensuring that the perspectives of younger royals were considered in decision-making processes. His proposal represented a complete reversal of the attempt to exclude Charlotte from staff assignment decisions. Charlotte responded to this proposal with enthusiasm tempered by practical caution. She wanted to ensure that any formal mechanism would have real influence rather than being a token gesture designed to make her feel heard without actually affecting outcomes. Her questions about implementation details demonstrated that she understood the difference between symbolic participation and genuine policy influence. The administrators found themselves engaged in serious discussions about constitutional issues and institutional reform that none of them had anticipated when they had planned Marcus's routine transfer. Charlotte had successfully elevated a simple personnel matter into a comprehensive review of royal operations, and she had done so using skills and knowledge that challenged their assumptions about childhood development and royal education. Mrs. Hastings began to consider whether Charlotte's obvious capabilities might require adjustments to her educational program. The princess had demonstrated intellectual and strategic abilities that were significantly advanced for her age, and trying to manage her through approaches designed for typical 10-year-olds was clearly ineffective. She started thinking about how to channel Charlotte's talents constructively rather than simply trying to contain them. As the morning progressed, the participants gradually recognized that they had witnessed something unprecedented in palace history. A royal child had successfully challenged established authority structures and forced serious consideration of fundamental policy changes. Charlotte had proven that intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking could overcome traditional power imbalances even when wielded by someone who was barely 10 years old. The conversation began to focus on practical implementation of the various proposals that had emerged from the discussion. Charlotte insisted on specific timelines and measurable outcomes to ensure that the promises being made would actually result in meaningful changes. Her attention to detail and follow-through demonstrated that she had learned important lessons about how institutions could promise change while actually maintaining the status quo. The morning briefing that had begun as a routine administrative meeting was ending as a constitutional convention that would reshape power relationships within the palace for years to come. Charlotte had not only saved Marcus's position, but had also established herself as a force that would need to be reckoned with in all future decisions affecting her life and interests. The young princess had grown up in a single morning, and everyone in the room understood that palace operations would never be quite the same again. The weeks that followed Charlotte's confrontation with the palace administrators brought changes that rippled through every level of royal operations in ways that no one had fully anticipated. The young princess had not only succeeded in protecting her friendship with Marcus, but had also fundamentally altered the relationship between royal children and the institutional structures that govern their lives. What had begun as a simple personnel dispute had evolved into a transformation of palace culture that would influence royal family dynamics for generations to come. Marcus remained in his position, but under the new guidelines that had emerged from Charlotte's policy discussions with the administrators. These guidelines represented a revolutionary approach to staff interactions that balanced security requirements with acknowledgement of the human relationships that naturally developed within the close quarters of palace life. The protocols recognized that authentic connection could enhance rather than compromise professional effectiveness when properly channeled. The implementation of the new policies required careful coordination between different departments, and Charlotte found herself included in planning sessions that would have been unthinkable before her morning room confrontation. Her insights proved valuable not only for their practical wisdom, but also for their fresh perspective on problems that adults have been approaching in traditional ways for decades. Margaret Thornfield discovered that working with Charlotte as a consultant rather than simply managing her as a child created unexpected opportunities for improving palace operations. The princess's observations about staff morale, communication patterns, and operational efficiency provided insights that senior administrators had missed despite their years of experience. Charlotte's outsider perspective, combined with her insider access, gave her a unique vantage point for identifying areas where changes could benefit everyone involved. The success of Charlotte's policy influence created a model that was gradually extended to her brothers, Prince George and Prince Louis, though neither of them showed the same level of interest in institutional reform that had driven Charlotte's activism. George was more focused on his future role as heir to the throne, while Louis remained primarily interested in typical childhood activities. Charlotte's unique combination of intelligence, determination, and social awareness made her a natural reformer in ways that her brothers were not. Prince William and Catherine initially expressed concern about the precedent that Charlotte's confrontation had established. They worried that allowing royal children to challenge palace authority directly could create chaos and undermine the stability that was essential for effective monarchy. However, they also recognized that Charlotte's approach had produced positive results that traditional methods had failed to achieve. The parents' concerns were addressed through ongoing discussions with Charlotte about appropriate channels for expressing disagreement and pursuing change. The princess demonstrated her understanding of these nuances by working within the new system she had helped create rather than continuing to rely on direct confrontation. Her willingness to operate constructively within reformed structures showed maturity that impressed even skeptical observers. Charlotte's relationship with Marcus evolved into something that served as a model for healthy interactions between royals and staff members. Their friendship remained genuine and meaningful while respecting the professional boundaries that ensured security and appropriate behavior. The success of their relationship under the new guidelines provided evidence that Charlotte's original arguments about balancing authenticity with professionalism had been correct. The media attention that had been feared by the administrators never materialized in the negative ways they had anticipated. Instead, gradual leaks about the palace's more flexible approach to staff relations generated positive coverage that portrayed the royal family as modern and human. The public response suggested that Charlotte's instincts about the benefits of authentic connection had been accurate from a public relations perspective as well. Other palaces and royal households began to study the innovations that had emerged from Charlotte's confrontation, recognizing that traditional approaches to managing royal children might need updating for a generation that was growing up with different expectations and capabilities. Charlotte's success inspired similar reforms in other royal families, making her influence extend far beyond the British monarchy. The academic community also took notice of Charlotte's achievement, with child development experts and organizational psychologists studying how a 10-year-old had successfully challenged institutional authority and negotiated meaningful change. Her story became a case study in child advocacy and institutional reform that influenced approaches to youth empowerment in various contexts. Charlotte herself adapted to her new role as a policy influencer with the same intelligence and strategic thinking that had characterized her original confrontation. She learned to work effectively within committees and planning sessions, developing skills in negotiation and compromise that would serve her well in future royal responsibilities. Her early experience with institutional change gave her practical knowledge about leadership that formal education could not provide. The princess also maintained her academic studies while taking on her expanded role in palace operations. Her teachers noted that her real-world experience with organizational dynamics enhanced her understanding of history, politics, and social studies in ways that made her classroom learning more meaningful and applicable. The integration of practical and theoretical knowledge accelerated her intellectual development. Marcus found his own career enhanced by his role in the policy changes that had emerged from Charlotte's advocacy. His insights into security operations from relationship-building perspective proved valuable in training other guards and developing new approaches to royal protection. The experience demonstrated that staff members who were trusted and included in policy discussions could contribute more effectively to palace operations. The long-term implications of Charlotte's stand began to emerge as she approached her 11th birthday. The palace had evolved into a more collaborative and responsive institution that took seriously the perspectives and needs of all its members, including the youngest royals. The changes created a more sustainable and humane approach to royal life that reduced conflicts and improved morale throughout the organization. Charlotte's brothers benefited from the precedents she had established, even though they had not been directly involved in creating the changes. The new policies provided them with more flexibility and voice in their own lives while maintaining the structure and support they needed for their development. The palace had become a place where royal children could grow up with both privilege and agency. The story of Charlotte's confrontation with palace administrators became part of royal family lore, told and retold as an example of how courage and intelligence could create positive change even in the most traditional institutions. The young princess had proven that age and size were not barriers to effective leadership when combined with clear thinking and unwavering determination. As Charlotte looked back on the events that had transformed her life and the palace around her, she understood that the most important lesson had not been about winning a specific battle, but about learning to use her voice effectively and constructively. The experience had taught her that challenging authority was most successful when combined with offering practical alternatives and working toward solutions that benefited everyone involved. The palace that Charlotte inhabited after her stand was fundamentally different from the one where she had grown up feeling constrained and voiceless. The changes she had initiated created an environment where royal children could develop their full potential while preparing for their future responsibilities. Her legacy was not just the preservation of a friendship with a guard, but the creation of a more humane and effective approach to royal life. The transformation also established Charlotte as a leader within her family and the broader royal community. Her ability to create positive change through intelligent advocacy positioned her as someone whose opinions and insights would be valued throughout her life. The skills she had developed at age 10 would serve her well as she grew into her future role as a senior member of the royal family. Years later, when Charlotte would face other challenges and opportunities, she would remember the morning when she stood in the palace conference room and refused to accept decisions made without her input. That moment of courage and determination had not only changed her immediate circumstances, but had also established patterns of leadership and advocacy that would define her approach to royal service throughout her life. The young princess had learned that real power came not from titles or traditions, but from the ability to think clearly, speak truthfully, and work effectively with others towards shared goals. Her confrontation with palace administrators had been just the beginning of a lifetime of using those skills to make the monarchy more responsive, more humane, and more effective in serving the people it was meant to represent. Charlotte's story became an inspiration for young people everywhere who felt that their voices were not being heard by the adults and institutions that controlled their lives. Her example showed that age was not a barrier to making meaningful contributions to important conversations, and that courage combined with intelligence could overcome even the most entrenched systems of authority. The princess who had stood her ground in a palace conference room had also stood up for young people everywhere who refused to be silenced simply because they were small.